are going to be learning all about apostrophes. Or is it apostrophes? 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 Well, the good news is that by the end of this lesson, you'll know which of these variations is the correct one. So let's start with a pop quiz. Many people struggle with knowing when to use an apostrophe and when not to. So take a look at these two signs, and if you look closely, you'll notice that there's an apostrophe in the first grapes and not the second. Well, these signs say that bunches of grapes are on sale for 2 for $1. I'm not going to reveal the answer just yet, so grab a pen or something to write with and jot down which of these two variations of grapes you think is the correct one. We'll come back to this later in the lesson. So when do we need to actually use an apostrophe? There are two main reasons for using the apostrophe, and the first one is to show possession. So when something belongs to someone or something, we use an apostrophe to indicate the possession or belonging. We'll get into that in just a moment with some specific rules and examples. The next reason for using an apostrophe is to show that something has been omitted or deleted. The most common form that you'll see in this is your contraction, whereby the apostrophe demonstrates that certain letters have been deleted. And we'll get into that in more detail as well. So, how do you use an apostrophe to show possession? Well, if you're dealing with a regular noun, it's not so difficult. If you have a singular noun, to make it possessive, just add an apostrophe s at the end. So let's imagine we have a unicorn and we want to say the unicorn's horn. Well, pronouncing it, we know it's unicorn's horn, but how do we spell that? This rule tells us we just have to add an apostrophe s at the end. So we'll write the unicorn apostrophe s horn. Simple. But what happens when we have more than one unicorn? If we have two unicorns, what do we need to do? Well, if we're dealing with a regular noun whose plural is formed by just adding an s to the end, it's pretty simple. We'll just add an apostrophe after the s in the plural form. So we have unicorns, and we're going to have the unicorns' horns, which is going to be unicorns s apostrophe. Easy peasy. Let's look at one more example just to reinforce this rule. So imagine we have a cat and we want to say the cat's tail. We're just going to write cat apostrophe s for our singular possession. Now, if we have multiple cats, maybe we have a family of 3 cats and we want to say the cat's tails, since this is a regular noun, we make the plural by adding an s. We'll make it possessive by adding an apostrophe after that s. So it's going to be cats apostrophe tails, the cat's tails. Pretty simple when we're dealing with our regular nouns, but we have some irregular nouns whose plurals are formed not by adding an s. We actually change the ending, and there are some specific rules for dealing with that. So let's take a look at an example of an irregular. And when you're dealing with the irregulars, we're going to add an apostrophe s at the end, and you'll see that in just a moment. So if we have a child and the child has a balloon, this is a simple singular noun. We'll just write child apostrophe s, just like we saw on the last slide. But if we have children, and now we have the children's balloons, this rule says that we just have to add an apostrophe s. So this is now going to become the children apostrophe s balloons. Now you might feel tempted to write the children's s apostrophe or the children's s apostrophe s, the children's is, but neither of these forms is correct. So be careful with that. Let's look at another example of an irregular plural noun just to let this sink in a bit more. So if we have a mouse, one mouse, we want to say the mouse's tail, mouse apostrophe s. And when we have more than one mouse, we say mice. So imagine we have 2 mice and we want to say the mice's tails. We'll write mice apostrophe s. Again, be careful not to do one of these words that doesn't even exist, the mice's apostrophe or the mice's tails. Those just aren't ever going to be correct. But what happens when a word like maybe a proper noun, somebody's name ends in an S? What do we do in that situation? Take a look at the following examples. We have James S apostrophe S laptop and James S apostrophe laptop. Well, the truth is, there is no one hard and fast rule for dealing with this situation. In fact, many people, grammar nerds, argue about which the correct usage is. If you're not sure, consult with your teacher. Or if you're using MLA or APA, look at your style guide and make sure you conform to whatever that style requests in your writing. And if you're not following a specific format, just make sure to be consistent in your use of the apostrophe and whether or not you add an S when dealing with a singular proper noun that ends in S. All right. So then we have our possessive pronouns and adjectives. And remember, a pronoun replaces a noun. So it's actually interesting because if you looked on this list of possessive pronouns, none of them get the apostrophe. And that's a really good rule to remember. Many people get confused with its versus its, and they get a little bit stuck. But if you remember the rule that none of the pronouns get the apostrophe, and you're thinking, I want to say the cat ate its food, well, I'm not going to use the apostrophe because it's possessive. All right, so this is a good list to kind of memorize. But let's take a look at the contractions. So contractions happen when we combine two words and we omit one or more letters. The apostrophe essentially represents the missing letter. So let's look at this list. Now we see the it's here with the apostrophe. In this case, it's what the apostrophe represents, it is. We'll see an example of each of them in use in a moment. The next few words down here and their contraction form, this is not a comprehensive list by any means, but it just goes to show how this apostrophe in each word, in each contracted form, demonstrates that we're missing some letters. So some confusing constructions to keep in mind. As I mentioned, it's and its. We want to be careful. It's and its, whose, your, theirs is another big one that's not on here. So let's just take a look at each of these in use. Whose pencil is this? You see here, whose, there's no apostrophe because we're dealing with possession. And we could say, well, who's using this pencil? In this case, whose represents who is using this pencil, and that apostrophe represents the missing letters. And then we could say, your pencil is blue. Again, possession, no apostrophe. You are using a blue pencil. You are using a blue pencil. And finally, its point is sharp. Possession, no apostrophe. And it's fun to write with a pencil. It is fun to write with a pencil. We see that apostrophe in the contracted form. Okay, so moving along, there are some other reasons to use an apostrophe, and most commonly you'll see them dealing with other forms of omission. So when you're dealing with years, if you wanted to take a shortcut maybe and say the 60s instead of the 1960s, you could use an apostrophe to show that a few numerals have been omitted. But keep in mind, if you're going to write out the whole year, the 1960s, you don't want to use an apostrophe. So be very careful with these two. Another reason to use an apostrophe and show omission would be for certain colloquial expressions. So lots of words that we use in our speech and our informal writing, not necessarily in academic writing. And you say things like get 'em. You see here the apostrophe represents the missing TH because really this means get them. Or how y'all doing? So the apostrophe can be in different parts of the word. And again, oftentimes it is going to appear in a colloquialism. And one note for contractions in general, it's usually a good idea to steer clear of contractions in academic writing. But if you're not sure if you're allowed to use them, always ask your teacher. And one more rule that we're going to go over today, and of course, there are always exceptions, but this is the last one that we're covering in today's lesson, is when you have a confusing situation. So the most common one will be when you're dealing with lowercase letters. So if I wanted to say, there are two E's in elephant, we would use an apostrophe to show that we mean this lowercase letter E. Otherwise, it would just say ES, and that could be confusing. Be very careful. This is a very rare exception for using an apostrophe in a plural form. Normally, with your regular nouns, you're not going to use an apostrophe for your plural form. So that brings us back to our pop quiz from earlier. Remember those bunches of grapes? Has your answer changed? We're looking at bunches of grapes. We're not dealing with possession. We're just looking at more than one bunch of grape. So since we're looking at the plural form, we wouldn't need to use an apostrophe. And the one on the right, bunches of grapes without the apostrophe, is going to be the correct one. And coming back to the very first slide, all about apostrophes, well, we're just talking about more than one apostrophe. So we're not going to actually need to use an apostrophe in the plural form of the word apostrophes. Okay, so that's all for today's lesson. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Have fun with your apostrophes, everyone.